All right, Honors Biology. We're going to continue today with our unit on reproduction. And the last couple of days, we've kind of been going through, um, kind of the male's role of reproduction, or the male's role in the reproductive process, as well as the female's role. So if you missed any of those lectures, make sure you get those lecture notes. I made a video yesterday about the female reproductive system and the menstrual cycle, so make sure that you watch that if you haven't done that yet. Now, today we're going to talk a little bit about development, how the baby will develop inside the mother. And again, just like with the other lectures that we've had, there's lots of vocabulary. So make sure after you take these notes today, you kind of review them and go over some of the vocab words that are new to you, which there probably will be a lot of those. So, at the end of yesterday's lecture, we talked about fertilization. The fact that a sperm cell could reach an egg and fertilize that egg, right? We've talked about this all year long, right? Two haploid gametes, right, can fuse together to form a diploid zygote. Now, typically, fertilization happens in the fallopian tubes. It happens inside one of the oviducts, which the word oviduct and fallopian tube are kind of the same thing. So again, those sperm cells have to swim up through the uterus and they have to find the egg, which is in one of the two fallopian tubes. And if they get there, there's a good chance fertilization could possibly happen if the egg is waiting there. Now, as soon as that egg gets fertilized by a sperm, that zygote is going to form. A zygote is another name for a fertilized egg. So, as soon as that happens, there's going to be cell division. We've talked about this again this year, right? I mean, one cell, one zygote eventually becomes two, eventually becomes four, and then eight, et cetera, et cetera. Within a couple of days, you're going to have probably hundreds of cells that make up the early stages of that individual. We have a term here. It's called a blastocyst. A blastocyst is basically kind of a hollowed out ball of cells that forms after multiple cell divisions, usually after several days. So again, once we get to that stage called a blastocyst, then things start to happen. They start to change a little bit. We'll talk about what some of those changes are. But that blastocyst eventually is going to kind of implant itself in the walls of the uterus, and the mother will nourish it and take care of it for the next 9 months. And again, we'll kind of get into how the mother's body does that as we get through this PowerPoint today. Here's a um, a vocab term. It's called gastrulation. Now, gastrulation, we've talked about this previously. It's been a while, but this blastocyst, this hollowed out ball of cells, eventually those cells are going to start to differentiate. The word differentiate means to change. You might remember back, earlier in the year we talked about stem cells. Right? Stem cells are cells that have the potential to turn into different types of cells in the body, like some stem cells will turn into brain tissue or turn into muscle cells or whatever. But the term gastrulation, what's happening here is the blastocyst is starting to go through these changes. These cells are not only starting to change, but they're starting to migrate, they're starting to move to different areas of the cell. So again, this term gastrulation, if we had to come up with a definition of it, it says the process at which cells begin to differentiate into specific cell types. For example, these yellow cells here that you see in the middle, those cells are going to become certain types of tissues. The cells that are on the outside, these blue cells, they're going to turn into different types of tissues or organs. And these red cells, the same thing, okay? So this process happens early on in development, and those cells start to differentiate. That's a really important word, differentiate. So let's talk about these different types of cells. Basically there's three different layers. We have what we call the ectoderm, the endoderm, and the mesoderm. So, for example, in this little animation that you're seeing here, these blue cells, these are the ectoderm, or it's the ectoderm layer. Those cells will eventually become the skin and the nervous system, basically the brain and the spinal cord. The inner layer, which is this yellow layer here, that's called the endoderm, and those cells eventually become the digestive system and the respiratory system of the baby. And then we have the mesoderm, which is these kind of reddish colored cells, kind of reddish and purple, I guess. That's the middle layer, mesoderm, and those things become the skeleton, the muscles, the circulatory system, and also the reproductive system of the baby. So again, every layer is going to eventually give rise to different types of cells. So make sure that we kind of understand that, know what gastrulation is, know what these different layers eventually are going to form. Now, here's another thing too: is you've heard this word before, embryo. Okay, once this process of gastrulation starts to occur, then we can start considering this ball of cells to be an embryo. Those cells are starting to become specific things, specific types, and at that stage, we basically call it an embryo. And so the embryo is going to continue to develop. The amniotic sac, as the process of differentiation and gastrulation, and eventually the baby starts to develop, there's a structure called the amniotic sac that forms that will kind of surround or kind of encompass the embryo as it continues to develop. Now, that embryonic sac is going to fill up with fluid that's called amniotic fluid. That amniotic fluid is what the baby's going to basically be floating in, for the duration of the pregnancy. That amniotic fluid, basically, it kind of acts as sort of a shock absorber. Kind of helps protect the baby. It also helps to insulate the baby, make sure the baby is warm enough to survive, the next 9 months of the pregnancy. The placenta. I'll move myself over here. The placenta. Maybe down here. The placenta is probably the most important structure in the female body during the 9 months of pregnancy. Think of the placenta as sort of the life support system that helps keep the baby alive, during the pregnancy months. If you kind of look here at my cursor, you know, obviously here's the baby, but this kind of area here, which basically is the lining of the uterus. This particular region, though, is kind of a unique area of the uterus that is basically what's connected to the baby through the umbilical cord, and it's kind of what keeps that baby alive. It provides it with nutrients and oxygen gas and all the things that it's going to need. If you look at this picture here, which is kind of a little bit more of an enlarged view of the placenta. Here we have the umbilical cord, which obviously is connected to the baby. But over here, if you again look at my cursor, this is the placenta, and you kind of see this purple area in the middle. That area is kind of a gap. It's kind of a gap between the mother's bloodstream, or the mother's blood vessels, which we kind of see over here, right? Those are all the maternal blood vessels. And then we have the baby. The baby's blood vessels are over here on the left. But you'll notice that those blood vessels don't actually connect together. They don't actually touch. What that basically means is that the mother's blood and the baby's blood really never comes into direct contact with each other. And that's kind of an important thing. You might remember back, we talked about different blood types. I mean, the baby might have a completely different blood type than the mother. So it's kind of a good thing that the bloods don't actually come in contact with each other. There's some repercussions for that might occur, but Um, Basically this gap here, that little area in purple, is where all the materials are going to be exchanged from mother to baby and baby back to the mother. So think about some of the substances that can kind of move back and forth, from the mother to the baby. The mother's going to transfer oxygen, obviously, to the baby, nutrients like proteins and amino acids and carbohydrates and all that type of stuff. Hormones, chemical messages, antibodies might be good for immunity. Here's a new word here. It's called a teratogen. Teratogens are dangerous chemicals that might pass from the mother's bloodstream to the baby's bloodstream. One thing that just kind of comes to mind might be alcohol. Maybe you've heard of something called fetal alcohol syndrome. If the mother is drinking while she's pregnant, alcohol can actually pass from the mother's bloodstream, across the placenta to the baby. Nicotine, from cigarette smoke, same type of thing. That would be considered a teratogenic chemical. So, anything that could be dangerous to the baby could also pass through. That's why, the mother's health is important to the baby, because if the mother is putting unhealthy things into her body, those things very well could get into the baby's bloodstream. Now, as far as things that are transferred from the baby back to the mother, or from the baby's bloodstream to the mother's bloodstream, one thing that comes to mind is carbon dioxide, right? The baby, all the cells of that baby produce carbon dioxide gas, which is a poison. It can't stay in the body. So that carbon dioxide has to travel through the umbilical cord, cross, over that kind of placental gap there, and then enter the mother's blood and then go back to the mother's heart. So, I mean, think about this. I mean, a pregnant woman, every time a pregnant woman exhales, she's not only breathing out her carbon dioxide, she's also breathing out the baby's carbon dioxide. Same thing when she inhales. She's not only breathing in oxygen for her own body cells, but she's breathing in oxygen to go to the baby as well. And then finally, there's another term here called urea. Urea is basically any other type of cellular waste. Normally, that cellular waste would be passed through urine. But in this case, a lot of that urea is actually passed through the umbilical cord. It goes to the mother's placenta. And again, that gets passed on through the mother's urinary tract. So when the mother urinates, she's releasing not only her cellular waste, but also releasing some of the baby's cellular waste. So that placenta is a pretty important structure that connects the baby to the mother. All right, trimesters. The term gestation period. Gestation is basically how long the baby is going to stay inside the mother. And a normal pregnancy would be about 9 months or 38 weeks. But we typically break that down into 3-month periods called trimesters. So just listing here some of the different things that occur during each trimester. Okay, the first trimester, the first 3 months. Actually, if you look at this and read this list here, lots of things happen during that first trimester. The organs begin developing. We're talking everything, from stomach to lungs and heart and everything. The heartbeat's going to start around week 5. Different sides of the brain start to form. Sex organs, by the end of the first trimester are pretty evident. Arms and legs. I mean, a lot of things here. By the end of the 9th week of pregnancy, typically by the end of the first trimester or close to it, we can consider that embryo a fetus. By that time, by the 9th week around, we can pretty much start telling that is a baby. You can see the facial features and the arms and the legs and the head and feet and everything like that. Second trimester, this is where the baby pretty much starts moving. The mother can start feeling those movements. You get rapid brain growth at this time. A lot of brain development in that second trimester. The fetus starts breathing in amniotic fluid. It starts using that to strengthen up its diaphragm muscle and its lungs, so that once the baby is born, it can start breathing air. But it breathes amniotic fluid, prior to that. Remember, it doesn't get any oxygen from the amniotic fluid; it gets that from the umbilical cord. But again, breathing in that amniotic fluid does help strengthen up those lungs. The third trimester, by this time, the baby just has to grow. I mean, it's for the most part developed. It just needs to get bigger. The lungs complete their development. The eyes can open and close. The fetus can start responding a lot to external stimuli, things like sound and touch and things like that. And eventually, towards the end of the third trimester, the fetus starts to position itself to be born. It kind of moves into what we call a head down position. That leads us to the birth. We're going to see a video this week, um, that will show you a live birth and kind of show you the different stages of it. But basically, there's kind of three distinct things that occur during the birthing process. Stage one is called the dilation of the cervix. The dilation of the cervix, and again, if you aren't sure where the cervix is, go back to my video on female anatomy and be able to tell where that is. But that's basically the opening to the vagina, or you can look at it as the opening to the uterus as well. But when that cervix starts to dilate, that basically means that the baby's head is going to start crowning. It's going to start moving its way eventually into the birth canal, which is the vagina. But there's a hormone, it's called oxytocin. And the mother's body releases it, and so does the baby. Babies actually produce it as well. This is what causes the uterus to contract. Basically, it's the uterus, attempting to push or force that baby out. Now, eventually, those contractions will, um, happen more frequently, and they'll be a lot more rigorous to the point where the mother will feel this cramping sensation. I'm not a woman; I've never felt it before, but eventually, she'll know when that baby's about ready to come out. But this hormone, in addition to being the hormone that stimulates contractions, it also stimulates milk production in the mother. So when that baby is born, that mother will have milk produced in her breasts in order to feed that baby and provide not only nourishment, but we've also talked about antibodies for the baby. The amniotic sac, remember that fluid-filled sac the baby is kind of floating in. That sac will break open. Maybe you've heard of, like, a pregnant woman and her water breaking. Well, that's exactly what that is. Sometimes the doctor will go ahead and induce that. He'll do that himself. He'll break the water if it hasn't broken on its own. But eventually, that liquid has to come out, and that's usually a pretty good indicator that the baby is coming pretty soon. Again, the cervix will dilate. That area that opens up into the birth canal, it will typically open up till about 10 centimeters. And usually the doctor will kind of measure that to see that the cervix has dilated to a certain point. And if it has, then baby's ready to come out. There's no stopping it really at that point. Now, if the cervix is having a difficult time dilating, the doctor will note that, and what they may have to do is they may have to go ahead and take the baby externally instead of having the baby pass through the birth canal. The doctor will make an incision in the wall of the uterus and basically pull the baby out. We call that a cesarean section or a C-section. It's a pretty common medical procedure. Um, However, I mean, I think it's a good time to reflect and think about maybe hundreds of years ago, how difficult childbirth may have been. If that baby wasn't going to come out the natural way, cesarean sections weren't anything that was commonplace. A lot of women died during childbirth because this procedure hadn't been invented yet. So, but nowadays it's fairly common. It's a fairly easy procedure to remove the baby if there's any type of complications during the birthing process. Stage two is the emergence of the baby. When the baby again positions itself, the head will come out first. It'll emerge into the birth canal. As soon as that head is out, the rest of it's coming. I have been through two births myself with my wife, and I can tell you that as soon as the head's out, the rest of it is on its way, like very quickly. So, that's a good sign. Once you can see the baby's head, that's probably not very long until the rest of the body comes out, and then the baby will be born. But finally, there's one more thing that has to be expelled, and that is the placenta. The placenta, which again was the baby's kind of life support system, that's attached to the uterus. The uterus will actually force it out. This usually comes out, a couple of minutes after the birth of the baby. It's still connected to the baby through the umbilical cord, but that will also be expelled, um, you know, shortly after the baby's actually born. So, I mean, what you end up getting is basically a baby that's still attached to the placenta through the umbilical cord. The doctor will usually very quickly clamp that umbilical cord and cut it, and eventually that area will become the belly button of the baby. Uh, you know, it's a pretty quick, pretty painless process. This picture you see at the bottom here, this is a fairly clean picture of the process, but here you have the baby still attached to the umbilical cord. Here you have the umbilical cord itself. You can kind of see how long it actually is. Then here we have the placenta. This was attached to the wall of the uterus, for 9 months of that pregnancy. But again, that gets expelled at the end of the birthing process. And the doctor will just snip that part right there, and eventually that little area will just kind of fall off, and it becomes the belly button. In this picture at the top here, you can see this is during the birthing process. Again, here's the cervix, right? The vagina is down here. That's the birth canal. So again, that cervix will continue to open and widen, or we use the word dilate. And when it gets to the point of about 10 centimeters, that baby's about ready to come out. So the mother will try to push the baby out, and usually in no time the baby is out. All right, so that'll do it, folks. Um, Again, we're going to watch a movie about human reproduction, which will kind of result in a birth. You'll see it, but we'll get to that more later on this week. All right, folks, have a good day, and I will see you soon. Take care.